Okay, let's start. Number 1. Sumer. You're standing in the temple archive at Nippur. The year is 1900 BCE. Around you, clay shelves hold thousands of tablets, each pressed with wedge-shaped script, while still wet, then baked hard in the sun. This is the E-kur, House of the Mountain, the holiest temple complex in Mesopotamia. Scribes here don't write poetry about their gods, they write inventories of them. Names, ranks, family trees, jurisdictions, precise as a tax ledger. The Anunnaki aren't metaphors on these shelves. They're a numbered administrative structure, and someone has written down exactly who answers to whom. Eridu, 20 miles south, claims the title of First City on Earth, the place kingship first descended when the gods handed authority to a human ruler. The Sumerian king list records this as plain historical fact, not allegory. Something was lowered, physically, from above, and men were told how to run what had been left behind. Excavations across southern Iraq have recovered hundreds of thousands of tablets. Nippur alone produced over 30,000. Scribal schools called adubas trained children for years to copy exact god genealogies, letter for letter, with no room allowed for improvisation. Samuel Noah Kramer's decades of translation work through the 1950s and 60s reconstructed most of the Sumerian pantheon from these scattered fragments, piecing together broken tablets held in 3 different countries' museum collections. Thorkild Jacobson's analysis in 1976 mapped the hierarchy precisely. Anu at the top, distant and rarely invoked directly. Enlil beneath him, holding the E-kur itself and commanding the weather and the fate of kings. Enki governing the waters and, oddly, secret knowledge, craftsmanship, and the arts humanity wasn't originally meant to have. 50 ranked deities below them, the Anunnaki proper, each with defined territory and function, no vague sky worship, a chain of command, documented with bureaucratic precision. But here's what makes Assyriologists sweat. The specific tablet category holding the fullest god genealogy, the godless series known as Anunum, survives today in fragments so incomplete that modern reconstructions rely heavily on later Babylonian copies, made centuries after Sumerian was already a dead. Ceremonial language nobody spoke at home. Meanwhile, ordinary economic tablets from the exact same archive rooms, grain receipts, wool counts, loan records, court disputes over inheritance, survive by the thousands, nearly intact, legible in places down to the exact quantity owed. The mundane paperwork lived. The god lists didn't. Elamite raiders sacked Nippur around 2004 BCE, and the E-kur's archive took catastrophic damage in that destruction, alongside a second wave of disruption centuries later. That's the accepted explanation. Cities burn, temples get looted first because temples hold wealth, and tablets are fragile clay that shatters underfoot during collapse. Warfare doesn't discriminate by subject matter. It's a straightforward answer, and for the ordinary tablets recovered from the same rubble, it holds up perfectly well. It doesn't explain the selectivity. Grain ledgers from the same rooms, the same fire, the same structural collapse, kept surviving in far better condition than the texts naming exactly what the Anunnaki were, how many of them existed, and where their authority originated. Fire doesn't read labels before it burns. If an invading army wanted plunder, gold and silver mattered, not stacks of unbaked clay. If the destruction pattern were random, the survival rate across categories should be random too. Across multiple independent excavations, it isn't. Some researchers who study the pattern across several Mesopotamian sites note something more specific than simple loss. The more precisely a tablet named the Anunnaki, rank by rank, function by function, the less likely it is to survive complete. Vague hymns, praising the gods in general terms, turn up intact by the dozen. The exact ledger of who they were and what they were owed is the one category that keeps failing to survive, at site after site, as if precision itself were the trigger. What if the destruction wasn't the fire at all, but something that happened to those specific texts once they got too accurate, something scribes were made to do, or prevented from finishing? The colophons on surviving god list fragments already hint at a deeper problem, one we'll return to before this list is finished. Why does one narrow category of tablet, out of every genre the Sumerians produced in enormous volume, show this consistent pattern of loss across independent sites, and why does the loss track so closely with how specific the text got? Why did a civilization capable of preserving grain receipts for 4,000 years fail specifically to preserve the one document naming its gods in full? And if kingship really was lowered from heaven, who exactly decided that the record of what lowered it needed to disappear? Number 2. Egypt. You're standing inside the Temple of Horus, at Edfu, 60 miles north of Aswan. The walls close in around you, covered floor to ceiling with hieroglyphic text carved between 237 and 57 BCE under the Ptolemies, nearly 3,000 years after the events the text claims to describe. Run your hand across the inscriptions and you're touching Egypt's own footnotes. The priests who carved these walls didn't claim to be inventing scripture. They state explicitly, in their own words, that they are copying an older document. One they call the Specifications, a text that predates the pyramids, predates dynastic Egypt itself, and has never once, in 2 centuries of excavation, been found. The Edfu building texts don't just gesture at divine builders in the abstract. They name them. The Shebtu, a group of beings the text credits with raising the first sacred mound out of the receding floodwaters, and it locates where they came from, a place the texts call the homeland of the primeval ones. Egyptologist E. Raymond, who spent years translating the material in the 1960s and 70s, found the geography deliberately strange, described in terms that don't map onto any real region of Egypt or its neighbors, a point of origin the text treats as somewhere outside the ordinary world entirely. The Turin King List, a papyrus compiled around 1200 BCE, backs this up from another angle. It doesn't start Egypt's ruler count with Menes, the first human king most textbooks teach as history's beginning. It starts with a dynasty of gods, then a line called the Followers of Horus, ruling for a span the papyrus lists in tens of thousands of years before a single mortal takes the throne. Here's what unsettled Raymond's own conclusions. Just as the text turns from what the Shebtu built to a fuller account of where exactly they came from and how they departed, the inscription breaks off, not damaged by time in the ordinary way, worn evenly like the rest of the wall. The specific passage describing their point of origin in the fullest detail is the one section where the carving itself goes shallow and unfinished, as if the priests started it and were stopped before completing it. No pharaoh from any of the more than 30 dynasties that followed is ever shown claiming credit for what the Shebtu built. That silence runs completely against the grain of everything else Egyptian kingship stood for. Egyptian kings never stayed quiet about their own legitimacy. Not once, not ever. Every pharaoh from Narmer onward carved his face, his name, his full lineage into stone at every opportunity, competing across centuries to out-monument their predecessors. Temples list ancestors going back generations specifically to prove divine right to rule over the 2 lands. Yet the followers of Horus, credited with tens of thousands of years of prior reign, left no statues, no named individuals, no tombs identified as theirs. Just the Edfu priests' insistence that somewhere an original text described them and their origin in exact detail. That original has never surfaced. Not at Edfu, not at Karnak, not in any museum collection, not in the Cairo storerooms, still being catalogued today. The Palermo stone, another fragment listing Egypt's earliest rulers before Menes, survives only as 7 broken pieces scattered across 3 museums, and no one has ever determined who shattered it or when. Egyptologists generally assume ordinary wear and transport damage. Plenty of comparably old Egyptian artifacts, carved from the same basalt, do survive whole. What if the unfinished passage wasn't abandoned but stopped? The specifications withheld at the exact point they became too specific about where the Shebtu had come from and where they'd gone. Some researchers point to the deliberate, structured nature of what did survive, a temple explicitly built to reference a missing original rather than invent one, as evidence the priests knew precisely what they weren't permitted to finish carving. It's a reading the mainstream firmly rejects. But nobody has found the specifications, and the one passage that would have settled the question is the one left incomplete. Why would Ptolemaic priests, 2,000 years after the fact, still be citing a source no one alive had seen, right up to the exact line that would name where its subjects came from? Why does the followers of Horus dynasty get an exact number of years, but never once a location for that homeland that survives complete? And if the specifications really existed once, in whose hands, exactly, did the ending disappear? Number 3. Baalbek. You're standing on a stone platform in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, dwarfed by 3 blocks of limestone stacked into a foundation wall. Each one runs roughly 64 feet long and weighs an estimated 800 tons, among the largest worked stones ever incorporated into a structure anywhere on Earth. A short walk away, a 4th block lies half-cut in its quarry bed, never freed from the bedrock, estimated at over 1,000 tons. Rome built a temple to Jupiter directly on top of this platform in the 1st century BCE, and Roman engineers, some of the most capable builders in the ancient world, never explained where the platform came from. They just built over it. Ancient writers called this place Heliopolis, City of the Sun, but the older name, Baalbek, predates Greek and Roman occupation by an unknown margin. Whatever religious structure stood here before Rome arrived left no inscriptions of its own, no foundation text, no dedication, no builder's name survives from the pre-Roman layer, only the platform itself and the megaliths, already in place, already too massive to move by any method the Romans are known to have used. Roman architecture across the empire relied on cranes and pulleys capable of lifting loads in the tens of tons, not hundreds. The gap between what Rome could verifiably lift and what sits underneath their temple has never been closed by an accepted construction method. What survives instead is regional memory, not inscription. Medieval Arab historians, including al-Masudi in the 10th century, recorded local traditions attributing Baalbek's foundation to giants, sometimes to Cain, in some versions, built as a refuge against a second flood at the command of Nimrod. Separately, and centuries earlier, the Book of Enoch, a Jewish text from the Second Temple period still treated as scripture in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, describes 200 watchers, heavenly beings, descending to earth and binding themselves by oath on Mount Hermon before taking human wives and teaching forbidden knowledge. Mount Hermon sits less than 30 miles from Baalbek, in the same mountain range, overlooking the same valley. Mainstream archaeology treats the trilithon as an ambitious but explainable feat of late Hellenistic or early Roman period engineering, possibly begun under earlier Phoenician religious use of the site, extended by Roman resources and favorable local geology. Quarry marks show tool patterns consistent with Iron Age chisels. Large stones were moved in the ancient world using sledges, levers, and enormous coordinated labor forces, and Baalbek's limestone, while exceptionally massive, isn't unique in composition. Difficult and unlike anything else attempted at that scale, but not necessarily impossible for a determined, well-resourced ancient state. It doesn't explain why no comparable stone, anywhere else the Romans built across 3 continents, comes close to this weight class, despite the empire having far greater resources at its most powerful sites than at this one regional temple complex. It doesn't explain why the platform's actual pre-Roman purpose left zero textual record, when Phoenician and Canaanite cultures elsewhere were prolific writers who documented far less significant structures in detail. And it doesn't explain why local tradition, independent of any Roman source, consistently locates something extraordinary and non-human at this exact site, in the same valley where the region's own religious literature places a landing of heavenly beings. Not just the purpose is missing, the people are. Whoever quarried, dressed, and positioned 800-ton blocks before Rome arrived left no name, no language sample, no burial, nothing an archaeologist can attach an identity to. Every other Bronze and Iron Age culture in the Levant left something: pottery styles, inscriptions, graves. This one site, the one carrying the heaviest worked stone on the continent, left a population-sized blank exactly where a population should be. What if the platform's original purpose was deliberately never committed to a surviving record, because whatever stood here before Rome built over it belonged to a religious memory later authorities had reason to erase along with the people who kept it, rather than preserve either? Why does the largest unmoved stone in the ancient world sit unfinished in its quarry bed, abandoned mid-extraction, with no explanation for why the work simply stopped? Why does regional tradition, across separate cultures and centuries, keep returning to the same valley for stories of beings who came down and built with their hands, while the actual builders themselves left no trace at all? And why did Rome, rather than documenting what it found, simply cover the platform with a temple of its own and let the original purpose and the people who held it disappear under the floor? Number 4. Teotihuacan, You're standing at the base of the Pyramid of the Sunday. It towers 216 feet above you, built from 3 million tons of stone and earth, the third largest pyramid on Earth by volume. Around you stretches an urban grid so precise it rivals Rome. 200,000 people call this place home in the year 550 CE, making it the sixth largest city on the planet. For 600 years, this civilization ruled Mesoamerica, and in 6 centuries of dominance, not one single ruler ever let his face be carved into stone anywhere in the city. Then one day, someone gives a signal, and the temples burn. In the Tepentitla compound, on the city's residential edge, a mural survives showing a central deity figure some researchers identify as the Great Goddess, standing before a cave mouth opening in a mountain, water and small human figures streaming outward from the opening below her. Esther Pastory's 1974 analysis reads it as an origin scene, the specific place and manner their gods first entered the world, rendered in enough detail that later Aztec pilgrims, walking these same avenues 800 years after abandonment, still called the city, the place where the gods were born. Fragments of the same processional imagery survive on soot-blackened plaster inside the burned temple core itself, too fire damaged to fully reconstruct, but detailed enough to suggest the fuller version, the one that showed exactly where and how, stood at a scale the surviving residential copy never approached. Renee Millen's excavations between 1962 and 1973 documented a city covering 8 square miles with over 2,000 apartment compounds and murals numbering in the hundreds. Every comparable civilization on Earth leaves images of its leaders. Egypt has pharaohs everywhere. The Maya have god-kings on every stela. Teotihuacan has nothing. No named ruler, no royal portrait, no dynasty listed anywhere across 20 square miles of the most powerful city in the hemisphere. The burning wasn't random looting spread across the city. Radiocarbon dating places it between 535 and 580 CE. George Cowgill's 2015 analysis found the fire concentrated almost entirely in elite structures, temples, and palaces, while ordinary residential compounds nearby were left largely untouched, their murals, including the Tepentitla goddess, undisturbed. Chemical analysis by Linda Manzanilla. In 2006, measured temperatures exceeding 1650 degrees Fahrenheit in those zones, hot enough to vitrify stone into glass. They went straight for the religious core, with surgical precision, and left everything else standing. Saburo Sugiyama's excavations at the Feathered Serpent Pyramid found ritual deposits sealed and carefully arranged just before the burning began, offerings positioned with the same care used in the pyramid's original dedication, as if the fire completed a ceremony rather than destroyed one. Obsidian workshop analysis by Michael Spence in 1996 shows production, halting mid-manufacture, blades half-finished, workers stopping mid-task and walking away. The working explanation is internal revolt. Drought conditions across the 6th century, food shortages, a rigid hierarchy, and mounting tension between elites and the population that built and maintained the city for generations. The lower classes burned elite structures while sparing their own neighborhoods, and the selective burning pattern genuinely supports that reading, class warfare rather than chaos. It still struggles with the precision. If this was revolt, why were offerings sealed in place before the fires, not looted during them? Why burn precisely the structures carrying the fullest version of the origin imagery, and leave the smaller residential copy standing untouched, as if the point was destroying the complete record while sparing the fragment? Some researchers, citing Maya inscriptions where fire is described as a ritual ending rather than destruction, ask whether the population itself closed a cosmic account once it had been fully depicted, retaining only the abbreviated version its own quarter kept intact. If that reading holds, the absence of royal portraits and the survival of one damaged goddess mural sit differently. A civilization that carved exactly where its gods first arrived, then burned the fullest version of that scene at 1650 degrees while sparing the smaller copy, coordinated across 200,000 people, with no chronicle explaining why. Why destroy the complete record and leave the fragment? Why target only the structures holding the fuller imagery? And who decided the residential goddess could stay while the temple version had to burn? Number 5. Gobekli Tepe. You're standing inside Enclosure D, on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey. The year is roughly 9600 BCE. T-shaped limestone pillars rise around you in a ring, some reaching 18 feet, weighing up to 16 tons apiece. Carved into their surfaces, foxes, boars, vultures, scorpions, and on the tallest pillars, stylized arms and hands, carved as if the stone itself were a body standing upright, waiting. This is older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than writing, by thousands of years, predating Stonehenge by roughly 6 millennia. And the people who built it had no permanent homes, no metal tools, no draft animals to move 16 tons of rock across open ground. They built it anyway. Then they buried it, on purpose, and built another one nearby. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating the site in 1994, and what he found overturned a century of assumptions about the order civilization is supposed to arrive in. The standard model taught in every textbook says agriculture comes first, then surplus food, then settled religion, then monumental construction. Gobekli Tepe reverses that entire sequence. Hunter-gatherers, people who moved with the seasons, stored no grain, and left no permanent settlements behind, organized labor on a scale usually reserved for centralized, settled kingdoms to build something none of them could have lived in or defended. Schmidt's team, working with the German Archaeological Institute across 2 decades of seasonal digs, found something even harder to explain than the construction itself. Each enclosure was used for a period of time, then deliberately filled in, packed solid with rubble, animal bone, and broken tool fragments, before an entirely new enclosure was raised a short distance away. Not collapse from age, not gradual erosion. Compacted backfill, layered in deliberately and by hand, entombing a structure that had taken enormous coordinated effort across multiple seasons to build in the first place, only to be sealed away just as carefully. No hearths, no houses, no domestic waste consistent with permanent occupation have ever been found within the enclosures themselves, despite extensive soil analysis. People traveled here from considerable distances, performed something, and left, generation after generation, across a span of many centuries. Enclosure D, the one you're standing in, is also the most densely and elaborately carved of everything found at the site, and Pillar 43 within it, nicknamed the Vulture Stone by researchers, carries the single densest composition of animal figures arranged around a headless human form anywhere on the hill. A scene some read as recording a specific event, a date, even a catastrophe involving the sky, though the site predates any writing system that could confirm precisely what the carving was meant to communicate. It is also, of every enclosure at Gobekli Tepe, the one buried first and buried deepest. The mainstream explanation treats the backfilling as ritual closure, a documented practice among early ceremonial sites elsewhere, comparable to later cultures respectfully decommissioning sacred spaces rather than letting them fall into disrepair. Structures age, meaning shifts across generations. A new generation builds its own version nearby and retires the old one with reverence rather than abandonment. It's a reasonable comparative pattern, and versions of it appear at other ancient ceremonial sites in less extreme form. It doesn't fully explain the labor math. Filling an enclosure this size with the volumes Schmidt's team measured meant moving nearly as much material as building the original walls required, performed by people who, by every other archaeological marker of the period, lived as small, mobile, foraging bands with no chiefs, no granaries, no evidence anywhere of centralized authority. Coordinating that scale of labor twice, once to build and once to deliberately erase, requires an organizational capacity archaeologists don't otherwise see anywhere on Earth for another 6,000 years. Some researchers ask what would justify a hunter-gatherer band expending that level of effort not once but repeatedly across generations, burying their own monumental achievement rather than simply abandoning it to weather in time. What if the enclosures weren't retired because they'd aged, but because whatever the carvings actually recorded was no longer meant to remain visible? Why does precisely the site holding the earliest known monumental art on Earth also show the earliest known pattern of monumental burial? What were people with no writing system at all trying to make sure the ground itself would keep permanently silent about? And if Pillar 43 really does mark a specific event, why was the very structure holding it the first one ever sealed away? Number 6. Nan Madol. You're gliding by canoe through a canal between stacked basalt walls. The year is roughly 1200 CE. On either side, columns of black volcanic rock rise like cordwood, some blocks weighing 50 tons apiece. This is Nan Madol, off the coast of Pohnpei in the Pacific, a city of 92 artificial islets built across 200 acres of coral reef. At its heart lies Nandawus, the royal mortuary complex, reserved for the Saudalur dynasty's most sacred rites. Pohnpeian oral tradition names exactly who built it, where they said they came from, and what happened once their line was destroyed. The tradition, recorded in detail by German ethnographer Paul Hambruch in the early 20th century, centers on two brothers, Olisipa and Olosopa, who arrived by canoe from a distant place, tradition places beyond the western horizon, beyond where ordinary voyaging canoes were known to sail. They came, the story goes, specifically to raise an altar worthy of their god, and after testing several islets, they settled on the reef and revealed the method. The basalt columns weren't hauled, they were flown, lifted into place using words of power the brothers alone possessed. Olisipa, the elder, eventually died of old age on the finished city. Olosopa remained, took a local wife, and became the first Saudalur, founding a dynasty built on a method of construction no one else in Pohnpeian history is ever credited with replicating. Radiocarbon dating places the major construction phase in the 1180s and 1200s CE. Basalt columns were quarried from sources scattered miles across the island, and no roads, sledge tracks, or labor infrastructure capable of moving 50-ton loads have ever been identified anywhere on Pohnpei. Nan Madol was never expanded after the Saudalur period ended. Whatever the brothers knew, no later builder on the island, across the centuries following the dynasty's fall, ever raised anything close to it again. The Saudalur dynasty ruled for centuries before its collapse, traditionally dated to around 1628, with the arrival of a culture hero named Isokelekel. Pohnpeian tradition doesn't describe this as an ordinary conquest between rival chiefs. It frames it explicitly as punishment, the last Saudalur ruler having personally offended the thunder god Nan Sapwe, whose anger made the dynasty's fall not just possible but inevitable, ending in a single generation, a bloodline that traced itself back to a being who arrived from beyond the horizon, and never fully explained where beyond meant. Archaeologists studying the site generally treat the flight legend as folklore, encoding a real memory of extraordinary labor, a culturally appropriate way of describing engineering so far beyond ordinary means that it could only be remembered afterward as magic. Basalt columns this size, moved this far across open reef without draft animals or the wheel, using canoes, rope, and enough coordinated manpower sustained across generations. Difficult under that framework, but not strictly impossible. That explanation asks a great deal of a population estimated in the low thousands at the site's peak, and it doesn't address why the method died completely the moment the dynasty did. If the construction technique were simply skilled labor, passed down through builders rather than granted by two founding brothers, someone should have kept building after 1628. No one did. What if the brothers claimed origin, and the specific words they were said to have used weren't cultural memory of hard labor at all, but the one piece of information that left with the bloodline when Nan Sapwe ended it? Why does no proposed human transport method fully account for 50-ton loads moved across open coral reef with the tools available in 1200 CE? Why does construction stop completely and permanently, the exact generation the dynasty falls, rather than continuing under new rulers? And why does Pohnpeian tradition insist, without hesitation, that the founders came from beyond the horizon, and that the god who ended their line was avenging something the last ruler had personally done to him? Number 7. The Bayan-Kara-Ula Caves. You're standing at the mouth of a cave system in the Bayan-Har Mountains, on the remote border between China and Tibet. According to the accounts that describe this place, rows of shallow graves line the chamber floor in neat, deliberate grids, arranged with a regularity that looks organized rather than accidental, cut into rock walls in a region so isolated that few outside surveys have ever reached it. This story is disputed, thinly sourced, and treated by most professional historians as unverifiable at best, invented at worst. It's included here for one specific reason. Whatever was or wasn't found in these caves, every piece of physical evidence anyone ever claimed to have recovered from them has since gone missing through official channels, and no institution has ever explained where any of it went. The story traces back to a 1930s or 1940s account attributed to a Chinese archaeologist named Chipu Te, describing an expedition into the cave system that turned up small, unusually proportioned skeletal remains alongside stone discs, each with a fine groove spiraling from a center hole outward, said to be etched with symbols too small to read clearly with the naked eye. The tale was popularized decades later, in the 1960s, by a writer named Tsum Nui, writing in a period when Cold War-era publications on both sides of the Iron Curtain had a voracious appetite for exactly this kind of unverifiable, sensational claim. Nui asserted the grooves formed a script, and that a partial translation described visitors who arrived from the sky and could not return home again. Local oral tradition in the region, predating the published accounts by an uncertain but likely significant margin, does describe a people called the Dropa, said to be small in stature, with a folk memory framed around beings who came down and were unable to leave. Whether that oral tradition inspired the later written accounts, or the written accounts have since reshaped how the tradition gets retold today, is itself contested, and serious ethnographic fieldwork on the region's folklore remains thin and hard to access. Here's where the story becomes less about aliens and more about erasure. According to the popularized version, the stone discs were sent away to institutes for study, in some tellings to Beijing, and were never seen again by anyone in a position to independently verify them. No catalog number exists in any known museum collection. No peer-reviewed analysis of an actual physical disc has ever been published. No photograph with a verifiable chain of custody survives. Mainstream archaeologists and skeptics alike have spent decades pointing out that the entire episode may be embellishment layered onto a smaller, far more mundane discovery, or invented outright for an audience primed by decades of pulp science fiction and Cold War paranoia. That skepticism is well earned, and it should remain the default reading. Chipu Te's original account has never been independently authenticated by any archive. Tsum Nui's translation claims were never verified by any independent linguist. No specimen, no disc, no skeleton has ever surfaced in a laboratory willing to publish findings under its own name. By ordinary evidentiary standards, there is nothing here that meets the bar for confirmation. And yet the pattern fits uncomfortably well against everything else in this list. Notice what actually survived and what didn't. The vague version, a folk memory of beings who came down and couldn't leave, with no names, no dates, no specifics, has been told and retold in the region for generations, and nobody has ever tried to confiscate it. The specific version, the one with an alleged translated text describing exactly who they were and why they were stranded, is the one piece of physical evidence that vanished the moment it might have been independently checked. Vague survives. Specific disappears, the same pattern as every other case on this list. If something entirely ordinary was found in those caves, why would the record of it disappear so completely rather than simply being debunked in print, the way most hoaxes eventually are? And if nothing was found at all, why does a remote mountain community's oral tradition already describe the same core idea before any outside writer ever arrived to sensationalize it for profit? Where did the objects described in the original account actually go after they were supposedly sent away? Why has no institute, in over 80 years since the claim first surfaced, ever confirmed or formally released any analysis, positive or negative? And why does the local tradition, entirely independent of the discs and their disputed fate, keep telling the same story anyway? Number 8. The Olmec. You're standing in the jungle at La Venta, on Mexico's Gulf Coast, facing a colossal stone head, 8 feet tall, carved from a single block of basalt, hauled here from quarries up to 90 miles away. The year is roughly 900 BCE. The face staring back at you isn't generic. It has individual features, a fitted helmet unique to this one head alone. 17 of these monuments have been recovered across Olmec territory, no two faces alike, each one a portrait of somebody specific. We don't know who any of them are. We don't even know what these people called themselves. Archaeologists gave them the name Olmec centuries later. It isn't theirs, and what their rulers actually claim to be isn't carved anywhere obvious. It's carved somewhere else. Alongside the portrait heads, Olmec altars carry a recurring image known as the Jaguar, a figure fusing the features of a human infant with feline, sometimes distinctly reptilian, characteristics, cradled in the arms of an adult figure, like something being formally presented rather than simply depicted. Researchers including Peter First, writing from the late 1960s onward, and Michael Coe read the imagery as more than decoration, a literal genealogical claim. The ruling lineage, in this reading, wasn't just favored by its gods. It began with one, a union between a human woman and a non-human being tied to rain and the earth, producing hybrid offspring, the were-jaguar infants shown being held up for display on the same altars that name no human king. If First's reading holds, this is the closest thing the Olmec left to a written statement of what their gods actually were and how their rulers were related to them. And those are precisely the monuments that don't survive intact. Michael Coe's excavations at San Lorenzo documented deliberate mutilation. Around 900 BCE, the altars and portrait heads carrying the hybrid origin imagery were defaced, faces battered, then buried in careful, purposeful arrangements, not smashed and abandoned, but interred with evident intention. 300 years later, 60 miles away, Laventa's altars received the exact same treatment around 400 BCE, in a civilization with no evidence of foreign conquest at either site. Two separate centers, generations apart, performing an identical ritual on precisely the monuments making the hybrid claim before entombing them. In 2006, the Cascajal block, found near San Lorenzo, was identified as the oldest known writing system in Mesoamerica, 62 distinct symbols in orderly rows. It remains undeciphered. No second example of the same script has ever been found. A writing system this early, this structured, appears once and never again. The standard explanation treats the mutilation, then burial pattern as political ritual tied to succession, a new regime formally retiring the previous one's sacred imagery on taking power. It's a documented practice in later Mesoamerican cultures, and the Olmec likely originated versions their descendants continued for centuries. Political transition, in this reading, not concealment of anything specific. It doesn't explain why the ritual repeats with such precision at unrelated centers 300 years and 60 miles apart, targeting specifically the hybrid origin altars rather than any other monument type, as though both sites were following a shared instruction about which claim needed defacing. It doesn't explain why a writing system this developed appears once, fully formed, with no predecessor and no successor. And it doesn't explain why the were-jaguar motif itself, an image with no clear mythological ancestor anywhere in the region's earlier record, arrives already complete, already sacred, at the very start, rather than evolving gradually. What if the mutilation wasn't political theater, but concealment of the one claim every new center had reason to bury, that its predecessor's power rested on a hybrid origin nobody could verify, and somebody eventually needed hidden? Why does an entire culture leave individually sculpted portrait heads of unnamed figures scattered across its territory, but never once carve their own name? What does the were-jaguar actually represent, arriving fully formed with no earlier version to trace it back to? And why does every altar that made the claim explicit end up defaced and buried, while the ambiguous portrait heads, naming no one and claiming nothing directly, were left standing? Number 9. Tiwanaku. You're standing at 12,500 feet above sea level on the Bolivian Altiplano, gasping in the thin air. Before you rises the Gateway of the Sun, a single 10-ton block of andesite carved into a monolithic arch. At its center, a figure grips a staff in each hand, its head ringed with rays. Nearby, at Pumapunku, stone blocks are cut with a precision archaeologists still can't fully explain, right angles accurate to fractions of a degree, interlocking joints that fit like machined parts. For centuries, Tiwanaku ruled the Andean highlands. Then, around 1000 CE, it collapsed, and the largest unfinished stones were left exactly where the work stopped. Spanish chroniclers recording Andean oral tradition in the 1500s, including Juan de Betanzos and Pedro Cieza de Leon, documented a creation story already ancient by the time the Inca inherited it. Viracocha, the story goes, rose out of Lake Titicaca in darkness and made the world, then shaped the first humans from stone before breathing life into them. He walked the land afterward, teaching, and when he reached the western coast, he kept walking, out across the ocean, and never came back. The gateway's central figure, ringed with rays and gripping twin staffs, is the image most researchers identify as Viracocha himself, carved at a scale and precision the city otherwise reserved for nothing else. Radiocarbon dates place Tiwanaku's occupation from roughly 300 to 1000 CE, with the city's peak between 600 and 800 CE, population estimates in the tens of thousands within the urban core alone, according to research led by Alan Kalata, beginning in the 1980s. Pumapunku's megaliths include blocks weighing over 100 tons, transported from quarries miles away. Toolmark analysis by Jean-Pierre Protzen and Stella Nair in 2000 found cutting precision that exceeded anything they could replicate using period-appropriate bronze tools, surfaces flat within fractions of a millimeter. Lake Titicaca sediment cores, studied by Michael Binford and colleagues in 1997, document a severe, sustained drought, beginning around 1000 CE, coinciding almost exactly with the city's abandonment. The mainstream explanation is agricultural collapse. Tiwanaku's raised field farming system, sucacolas, moderated temperature and moisture at extreme altitude and fed the population for centuries. When the drought hit, sediment cores confirm it was severe and prolonged. The fields failed, the surplus vanished, and the political authority that depended on feeding a concentrated population collapsed with it. People dispersed to smaller, lower-altitude communities. Straightforward climate-driven decline, the same pattern seen at collapsed societies worldwide. It doesn't explain Pumapunku's unfinished state. Blocks lie scattered mid-process, some cut and never moved into position, others abandoned at the quarry. Drought explains why farming failed. It doesn't explain why stonework already this far along simply stopped, mid-cut, rather than being completed with whatever labor remained during the decline. And no comparable precision stonework was ever attempted anywhere in the Andes again, not by the successor Aymara kingdoms, not by the Inca who inherited the region and its Viracocha tradition centuries later and built extensively in stone themselves, just never at Pumapunku's tolerances. What if the collapse wasn't purely agricultural? Tiwanaku's religious authority rested on maintaining exactly what the gateway depicted, a direct relationship with a creator god who had explicitly promised, in the tradition his own people carried forward, to walk away and not return. If drought arrived as a sign that promise had finally come due, a system built on divine presence would have had no answer for divine absence. The stoneworkers might have stopped mid-cut not because the labor pool collapsed, but because the reason to finish it did. Why does the most precisely cut stonework in the pre-Columbian Americas appear once, at Tiwanaku, and never again anywhere in the Andes afterward? Why were blocks abandoned mid-cut, rather than finished with reduced resources during the decline? And why does Andean tradition, independent of Tiwanaku's own ruins, insist that the being depicted on that gateway walked into the sea and chose never to come back? Number 10. Ebla. You're standing in a collapsed palace storeroom at Tel Mardik, in northern Syria. The year is roughly 2300 BCE, in the last days before the fire. Around you, more than 17,000 clay tablets and fragments sit stacked on wooden shelves that are about to burn and fall. Italian archaeologist Paolo Mathiei identified the site as ancient Ebla in 1964, but the discovery that changed Near Eastern history came in 1974 and 1975, when his team's epigrapher, Giovanni Pettinato, uncovered the royal archive still sitting in its collapsed position. Tablets found exactly where the shelves had dropped them. Ebla wasn't a footnote. It was a kingdom trading across the Near East, ruling a language nobody had documented before, contemporary with Sargon of Akkad himself. The tablets revealed Eblaite, a previously unknown Semitic language, and a sophisticated bureaucracy that recorded wages, textiles, trade agreements, and diplomatic correspondence in overwhelming volume. They also revealed something else. Ebla's scribes trained using lexical lists and religious vocabulary imported from Sumer, hundreds of miles south, the same scribal tradition behind the god lists at Nippur. Several of Ebla's own religious and mythological tablets carry the same scribal convention found there, a colophon stating the text was copied from an older exemplar, one the Ebla archive itself doesn't contain. Here's what struck Pettinato's team as they cataloged the find. Of more than 17,000 tablets and fragments recovered almost entirely intact, the overwhelming majority are administrative, wages, shipments, contracts, dry, bureaucratic record-keeping that survived the same fire in enormous volume. The religious and mythological texts, the tablets naming Ebla's gods and their genealogies, make up a small fraction of the total, disproportionately more fragmentary than the ledgers stacked beside them on the same collapsing shelves. The palace burned violently around 2300 BCE, a destruction layer confirmed by Matthias' excavations and generally attributed to Akkadian military campaigns in Syria, boasted about in inscriptions left by Sargon of Akkad and, in a later claim, his grandson Naram-Sin. Conquering armies destroy palaces. Fire consumes archives indiscriminately. That's the accepted explanation, and for the thousands of administrative tablets that survived the blaze intact, it holds up without much argument. It doesn't explain the selectivity. The same fire that baked and preserved tens of thousands of wage receipts left the religious tablets sitting beside them in the smaller, more damaged minority. War doesn't sort by genre before it burns a building down. If destruction were purely random, administrative and religious texts should have survived or been destroyed in roughly the same proportion. At Ebla, exactly like at Nippur 1100 miles and centuries apart, they didn't. What if the answer isn't in Ebla's fire at all, but in what its scribes admitted about their own religious texts before the fire ever started, that they were copies of a still older source, a source that traces back to the exact same Sumerian tradition and the exact same missing category of tablet this whole list started with? Every one of these 10 civilizations recorded the same category of claim in their own language, on their own material, and in every single case, the fullest version, the original, is the one piece that never survives to be checked. 10 civilizations, 10 records of the truth about their gods, and 10 missing originals. From Sumer's fragmented god lists to Egypt's cited but unfound specifications, from Baalbek's platform buried under a Roman temple to Teotihuacan's sealed offerings burned at 1650 degrees, from Gobekli Tepe's buried enclosures to Nan Madol's flown stones and the bloodline that died with them, from a cave story that vanished through official channels to the Olmec's defaced altars, to a gateway carved for a god who promised never to return, the pattern holds. All the way back to a burning archive in Syria, whose own scribes said the real version was somewhere else. Look at the rule underneath every single case. It's never the vague version that disappears. The myth survives every time, told and retold for centuries. It's the specific version, the one that got precise about names, ranks, origins, and departures, that never makes it to us intact. Whether it was the gods themselves closing the account or something else entirely doing the closing, the mechanism never changes. Get specific about who they really were, and the specifics are what go missing. If this kept you here till the end, it's because your brain doesn't accept coincidence 10 times in a row. Subscribe if you want the next 10. Like this if you've got a theory of your own, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.